Thanks for coming again this year. This is the second year Keith and a group of us have put this together, and we appreciate the turnout. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We focused a lot on fitting the cover crop into the corn-soybean rotation. And so Roger Elmore and I, the state agronomist, we're going to look a little bit, can we make some adjustments on the other end of this discussion? Can we make some adjustments on the soybean variety selection process and also the corn hybrid selection? So whether that's maturity or planting date or just some other things that might help us create a little bit more flexibility in our cropping systems to incorporate cover crops into corn-soybean rotation. So I'm going to focus on the first 20-25 minutes on soybeans. Then I'm going to turn it over to Roger, and he's going to focus on the corn part. So with that, I'm the extension agronomist or extension educator up in Dodge and Washington County. So I have people from the counties I cover up here today, so thanks for coming. Just to get started, maybe. Mark? There we go. Okay, so I think Cheryl's handing out my presentation. If you want to find it, even though it's recorded, I put a hard copy or a PDF version on my agronomy website called croptechcafe.org at soybeans and cover crops. So you can find the presentation there as well. So just kind of an overview of what I want to talk today, just the importance of soybean variety selection in our system in eastern Nebraska. In my previous role, I ran the variety testing program for South Dakota for corn, soybean, winter wheat, spring wheat, field peas, you name it. I did variety testing statewide as my job in South Dakota before moving back home. So something I'm going to focus on a little bit. How does relative maturity play into that decision? Can we shorten our soybean maturity and still get the same yield? So I'm going to present some really good data from Northeast and Southeast Nebraska on that in cooperation with FIRST trials. Planting date. And then last, how do all these things connect together to help us manage this cover crop in the corn-soybean rotation? So just soybean variety selection in general, where does that rank in terms of all the management decisions you make as a producer? Where does soybean variety selection rank in terms of importance of driving yield? Where do you think it ranks? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? 1? Anyone think it's something other than 1? 2? Something other than 2? You're right, it's number 1. I just wanted to make sure you just were verifying your belief or your information you had. It is number 1. The average yield difference driven by soybean variety selection in eastern Nebraska is 15 bushels an acre. And we'll look at this just for this last year's worth of data. So number 1, you make that decision every fall. Most of the time, I make that decision in the fall. And you're basing out a whole bunch of different things, and we'll talk about what you should base it on. Planting date, we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's right up there in terms, and I'll show you some data on that. And then we have all these other ones. Weed control, that's come up today, right? That can affect yield quite a bit. Phosphorus fertility, crop rotation, row spacing, seeding rate. And then last, I'll cover some information with on-farm research studies that we've done with some of you in the room and in the region. How did it affect soybean yield when we had a cover crop before? Field length trials, replicated, randomized on producers' fields with their equipment. So this is from this last year. This is for Northeast Nebraska. We'll also be sharing data, obviously, from Southeast Nebraska as well. But these are the FIRST trials. How many have heard of FIRST seed tests or the FIRST trials? Raise your hands. Okay. They've been around for a while. They're a third party that tests varieties and of companies, and it's really important third-party information along with information from your district sales manager or your whoever you're working with on the seed industry, as well as your on-farm data that we can get with yield monitor data now. So just this past year at our locations, here was the difference between the top performing variety and the lowest yield of that same variety of those varieties. At the Wisner location, there's 54 varieties tested. All these same 54 varieties are tested at all of these locations here, Wisner, Dodge, Herman, and Scribner. For Southeast Nebraska, we have Springfield this past year, Union, and Douglas. We had 36 varieties in those. So the same 36 in all 3. So we not only have multiple varieties at a location, but those same varieties are tested at multiple locations. That's helpful for drawing some conclusions. But there's some big differences sometimes. If you look at all of these, This is the top performing, poorest performing varieties at each of those locations, what the yield was. You average across all this number, and guess what the number is? 15.3. I've done this for South Dakota, over 5 years worth of data when I was there. Guess what the number was? It's like 15.0. So there's consistently been some variety performance differences. The thing is to figure out what variety do I plant on my farm, and guess what? Weather throws another factor in it. Just because it did well last year doesn't mean it's always going to do year in the next. So we're going to talk a little bit about diversifying our variety selection, not just all of our eggs in one basket, but not all our eggs in one basket in terms of maturity. And we'll talk about why that could be helpful in managing cover crops. So a little bit about their data if you haven't seen it before. The thing to really focus on, this is across the average of those 4 locations in northeast Nebraska: Dodge, Herman, Scribner, and Wisner. Here's the top performing varieties. 67 bushels is the top one. Then we have this fun number down here, and essentially this 3.7 bushels, it tells me what are the top performing varieties that I knew are likely due to the variety performance difference, not due to chance, air, experimental air, other things. So in other words, if there's a 3.7 bushel difference between 2 varieties, likely due to the variety. If there's a 2 bushel difference between those 2 varieties, it's essentially almost a 0 to me, meaning I'm not sure that 2 bushels is real. It could be due to just noise or variability that we have in our fields when we do these studies. So again, this is what we want to select for as producers, and the thing is, how do we do that? And so this is one source of information you can use. Companies don't test their whole product lineup in these trials, but they are submitting these on their own. So they're likely picking some of the better varieties or newer varieties that they want to see how it compares. So other considerations, on-farm data is becoming a lot more practical in terms of evaluating the performance of varieties. And I work a lot on the precision ag data management side, and we can do that. Third-party information like first trials, as well as company information. You know, it's just not all about yield. I mean, that's what we need at the end of the day, but there's other traits just besides yields in these trials. What happens if these trials didn't have SDS in the trial, but you have SDS, sudden death syndrome, in your field? Something you have to weigh out and look at, right? So other things to select for: sudden death syndrome, SCN, Phytophthora, lodging. All of those things come into play. And then this last one, range of maturities. I have really good data, fun data from South Dakota. Same 74 varieties tested at 2 locations, 40 miles apart, due east and west each other on the highway. Exact opposite relationship. One location, we had nice rainfall in August. As maturity increased, yield increased. At the other location, same 74 varieties, we didn't have moisture at that location. As maturity increased, yield went down. So it's not always full season beans yield better, short seasons soybeans yield better. It does depend. But we're going to look now at the data over the last 5 years in northeast and southeast Nebraska. What's the overall trend across all these locations, across all these years? So just before we get started on that, what is it going to help me when I decrease my maturity? How many days is that actually going to help me gain? If I want to drill a cover crop instead of aerial seeded cover crop, how many days sooner could I be drilling that cover crop seed? So this is data from Michigan. It happens to be the exact same maturity range that we're dealing with mostly in northeast Nebraska. And this is, I've seen this from Syngenta, a couple other organizations as well. As we go here from a 2.4 to a 3.2, essentially a day later in terms of maturity and harvest. So for every one, so if you went from a 3.0 to a 2.9, that's essentially a day sooner in terms of harvestability and maturity. So over this range here, we went from September 25th to October 3rd. So this time of the year, you got to remember what's the soil temperatures, what's the trend, we're getting cooler. So gaining extra days in September or early October is worth a lot more than gaining an extra day in November or December, right? In terms of emergence, germination, emergence, and growth. So it's just not just one day, it's actually worth more than that if you look at what gaining a day here is versus gaining a day later in the season. I worked with a group, across other soybean agronomists across the Midwest to look at what's the ideal maturity group, what's the updated map. A lot of you have probably seen this is the soybean maturity group I should plant for my region. Those maps were old. So we updated those, and this came out in just this past year. So we're kind of here, our normal range, or what we're kind of looking at for where we're at now compared to 30, 40 years ago, 2.5 here at the northern end, and probably somewhere around a This is 3.5, around that 3.8 at the southern border. So these are the general guidelines of where we should be. And so we have an updated map for you finally. But what does the specific data say for our locations here? We're going to use the same data that I showed you before. So here's for Northeast Nebraska, 67 bushels for top performing. All these essentially are the top performing varieties. Even though there's some yield difference here, it's less than that 3.7. Right? So I'm saying these are the top performing bunch. And then here's the maturity. Let's just see what that looks like in terms of a trend. Is there a pattern in terms of relationship maturity and yield? So for Northeast Nebraska, 54 varieties total. Out of those top performing varieties, here how it fell out. 2.5 on average. We only had one in that average, was 64.7. 2.6, we had 6 varieties that were in that top performing yield group. 64.5, and we keep going all the way here, are 3.4, 3.1, 64.5, and 63.6. Any trend? Notice anything there? It's pretty flat, isn't it? I mean, it hops up and down because we have different averages for those varieties. But what this tells me is I can pick a top performing variety in these different maturities, and it's going to compete. This 2.6s are doing just as well, right? 64.5 as my 2 varieties of the 3.1. So these are the top performing varieties out of all those tested. Same thing for Southeast Nebraska, actually 3.1 here, even just average of 1, we went from 61, where we had 5 varieties in that top performing yield group that were in the 3.4 maturity, 58.9, and again, 57, 57, 56. So it's a little hard to see in a table what the pattern is. It's kind of bouncing around, but it's not something real clear, is it? We're not seeing decreasing yield. So let's look at a figure instead of a table. It's a lot easier to see these relationships. So across 2012 to 2016, I'm going to start with the Northeast Nebraska, and then I'll move to Southeast Nebraska. What's the pattern? What are the pattern we're seeing over the last 5 years and the relationship between relative maturity of varieties and their yield in these trials? So out of all these years, 2012 through 2016, if you look at the range of yield we're getting, here's the 2.6s, and here's the top and bottom for the 3.4s. And you put a line through the middle of this data, it's pretty flat. So not only are the top performing varieties, you know, there's not a lot of difference. If you average across all of them, we're not seeing a clear trend here either. So again, what that tells me is I can do a good job of picking a variety that's yielding well based on third-party data, company data, my farm data, a 2.6 in Northeast Nebraska that can probably do just as well as a 3.4. Now we have this little trend here. Remember I talked about moisture? I didn't look to see what the rainfall moisture was at these locations in late August and September. So this pattern in 2012, and only half of the sites were there. There's some still up here. I saw that trend of increasing yield with fuller season beans. That could be due to 2 things, either extra rainfall maybe towards the end of August, September that we could have captured, or the other one, it could be maybe drought stress difference. And I didn't look or know, can't separate those 2 out because I didn't get the rainfall data and look at that for those locations in that year. But again, the takeaway here is we can do a good job of picking some high-performing yield varieties across these maturity ranges. And again, we can gain some extra days, get those out a little bit earlier. Southeast Nebraska, kind of the same thing, not quite as clear, but here, different scale. We're actually starting at a 3.1 up to a 4.0 for Southeast Nebraska. Again, you look at these lines for all these years, 2016 through 2012, fairly flat. Other than, again, 2 locations in 2012. How often does 2012 happen? Well, 2012 in Dodge and Washington County, the last time we had that dry weather was, I think, 1976. So in terms of that extreme, in terms of impact on yield. So it doesn't happen all the time. Let's hope it stays at that low frequency. But again, we can do a lot of things here with still keeping our yield that we want. So keeping our yields high with picking good short season varieties is an option. And should you pick, just because Nathan said that, should I plant all 2.6 so I can get my cover crop in earlier? No. I want to see still a range of varieties you're picking, but maybe there's some fields you really want to get cover crops on sooner or would benefit the most. Those might also be the fields you want to put the 2.6 on, right? So it's not an all or nothing when it comes to this type of information, this data, and this decision. So a little bit about planting date. This is work that Jim Speck did in Lincoln, and I thought the pictures he had really showed what I wanted to. He had different planting dates in 2003 and 2004. I'll show some new information in 2015 as well. But here's May 2nd planted beans all the way to June 16th, April 28th all the way to June 17th. So these are different planting dates. What happened? When did they harvest these? When did they mature? Okay, in 2003, maturity or harvest around the 7th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. So we gained some here, right, by planting a little bit earlier. We harvested them sooner. Not much difference in those last 3 planting dates in 2003. So if you just look at that data, why would I plant early doesn't mean I'm harvest earlier, right? What happened in 2004? September 21st, September 29th, October 10th, October 13th. Pretty big difference there. As we delayed planting, we did get later harvest. One thing you've probably all realized about soybeans is every year is different. They have a lot of plasticity, meaning they make adjustments in the year. So soybeans are a little bit more fickle to work with than corn, in my opinion. So again, you got to look at the data and say, on average, though, we're going to harvest. That makes sense. We're going to harvest early if we plant sooner. So another option, right? So relative maturity, planting date are both options to increase our window in the fall. So why did that happen? You got to remember the soil temperature and growth prior to V1 is dependent on what the conditions we're dealing with. So as you plant those soybeans later, it took less days, only 12 days to get to that V1, that one trifoliate growth stage, where it took 32 days early in the season. So we're making up some there. Same thing we saw this year, but guess what? You look at the time period from planting from V1 to R8, that changes too, meaning you plant beans later, they adjust their length of their growing season, and they mature faster than they did if you had planted them earlier. So soybeans have some flexibility, but what I really wanted to show you is you can gain some on planting date, but not every year are you going to always harvest sooner. 2003 was an example. So what's the impact of planting date and yield? You've probably seen this in crop watch articles from Nebraska Extension before, but on average in these 2 studies, as we decreased or delayed planting, we lost yield in 1 year, only a quarter bushel per day, though it was fairly flat for those first 3 planting dates for yield, and then it dropped down here. The other year, we lost almost over half a bushel per day, or 5/8 of a bushel per day by planting later. So again, the penalty for planting later is not the same every year. So again, 2015, what did we see? Again, about a quarter to almost a tenth of a bushel loss per day, 2 different maturity groups here. So the general trend is you want to plant earlier anyway in terms of yield most often than not. And second, we can change our relative maturity to gain some extra days without losing yield too. So how do we tie this all together? What's the actual impact? I've talked a lot about the maturity that we can pick, change in planting date, how that can change when we harvest. But what does the yield look like? What about the cover crop before? We've talked a little bit about that data, but we haven't shown you actual yield numbers with a lot of the presentations. So the fun thing is I get to work with farmers on their fields doing replicated, randomized on-farm research with their equipment on their field. So between 2010 and 2014, we had 6 studies in Saunders and Lancaster County done with producers on their fields, looking at what was the difference between without a cover crop and with a rye cover crop. So first location here in 2010, no significant difference, not significant, even though there's 4 bushels. I don't know if that 4 bushels was actually due to the treatment. I'm uncertain. So take that number for what it's worth. But then in another location, we had a 3 bushel increase. And when we ran the stats, we're saying, I'm about 96% confident that that 3 bushel difference was due to the cover crop. So we gained yield in that situation. Then at the other locations, not significant, not significant, not significant. So on average, we're getting about the same yield or slightly better with that cover crop before that we planted before the soybeans. So that's what happened on the front end, right? The cover crop we planted after corn, now we're planting soybeans. And then I've talked about what are we going to do after soybeans? Can we gain some extra days? What would be the advantage of planting a 2.6 and planting it early? How would that help us in terms of managing a cover crop? So again, early maturing and harvest. Well, one, spreading out harvest. You try to get soybeans at 13%, right? How often do you actually get 13% moisture beans? This year it was actually kind of weird. They hung on for a long time in October, at least locally. The weird year. Normally that's not the case. Sometimes it's 13% in the morning and 8% by the time you're done. You create a longer window for planting a cover crop. So create some flexibility in your system. Look at planting date, look at relative maturity. If there's fields you really want to cover crop to get it started fast, or make sure you're going to get in there regardless of kind of what happens in the fall, that gives you a bigger window for planting cover crops. Increased opportunity for early drilling. If you're aerial seeding, it's probably not as critical, right? But if you want to drill that cover crop, make sure you're going to get it moisture have moisture and get it in the field early. Gaining an extra 10 days for relative maturity, picking a 2.6 versus a 3.4 is going to help, and planting a little earlier. You're going to give yourself a bigger window to get that established. If it's rye or wheat, probably not as critical. If it's something that's going to winter kill, those extra days in September are worth a lot in terms of total biomass produced. So kind of to summarize, and I'll switch it over to Roger, we can pick high-yielding, short-season varieties that are good options for some of our acres. So talk to your seed dealer, talk to your DSM that you work with, look at what varieties those are, and add that to your farm as an option to get some cover crops maybe seeded a little bit earlier, and spread out harvest. So early planting, early harvest, early cover crop establishment is kind of what I wanted you to take away, that that's an option for us and that it's still economical. And cover crops before soybeans is essentially yield neutral to sometimes positive. So when you're looking at economics, Ray talked about all the other things we get, but we do have to look at finances at the end of the day. And I think there's some opportunities to use variety selection here to help us with cover crop management. So with that, I'm all done. Here's my information, either Twitter, the website, or my email, and I'll be around the rest of the day. Thank you. We'll take questions after Rogers and I are both done.